Welcome to Evidence Based, a new Harbinger psychology podcast. I'm your host, Cassie Stossel. On today's episode, we're talking about DBT skills for highly sensitive people. Our guest is Emma Lauer, licensed clinical social worker and author of DBT Skills for Highly Sensitive People. Emma is a therapist specializing in the treatment of eating disorders, self-harming behaviors, and trauma. She is an eye movement desensitization and reprocessing certified therapist and has taught at Arizona State University. She currently practices therapy and oversees interns and other staff therapists as clinical supervisor at Find Your Shine Therapy, a group private practice in Tempe, Arizona. Hi, Emma. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here with you.
I'm really excited to talk about highly sensitive people. So I thought we could start off with just talking about what is a highly sensitive person and how does someone become highly sensitive?
Yeah, so I think when people hear the term highly sensitive person, maybe a few different things come to mind. In the book, I use HSP and the phrase emotionally sensitive. So I would say my book is geared towards anyone who feels that they're highly sensitive, which could mean a number of different things, right? Whether that's just emotionally sensitive or the actual term HSP, highly sensitive person, which was coined by a psychologist named Elaine Aron. She wrote the original HSP book, and she developed this term based on a number of really specific criteria, and she followed this up with research. So based on Elaine Aron's definition, HSP is not only someone who's emotionally sensitive, but also has a stronger reactivity to both external and internal stimuli. So basically what that means is you're more sensitive to, for example, pain, hunger, light, noise, your environment, internal and external stimuli. So it's not just about being emotionally sensitive, but maybe you're more sensitive to like medications, or if you've ever felt like you are in a room and you're really sensitive to the vibe of the room, which is obviously not a scientific term, but it's the best way I can kind of describe it. So in the book, I address just emotionally sensitive people broadly, and I also speak a bit about highly sensitive people, like per Elaine Aron's definition.
And in your work, do you find that a lot of people are born this way and are emotionally sensitive their entire life, or is it something that someone can start to feel at any point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is definitely a large genetic component. We know that a lot of people who are highly sensitive, whether it's just generally emotionally sensitive or that more specific definition that I just described, we know that there's a strong genetic component there. We also know that if you experience trauma, for example, it can shrink your window of tolerance, which I talk about in my book, and I know we'll probably talk about that more later. And if your window of what you can tolerate emotionally has shrunken, you're going to feel more susceptible and more sensitive to your environment and internal and external stimuli, as we say. So the short answer is, for the most part, you're born that way, and stuff can happen that maybe makes you more sensitive.
That's very relatable. So how can DBT help?
Yeah, so DBT was specifically designed to help people who struggle with regulating their emotions. And, obviously, just because you are more sensitive doesn't mean you necessarily have trouble regulating your emotions, right? But if you feel things really acutely and really intensely, it's going to make it harder, right? So DBT offers skills to help people regulate their emotions, make friends with their emotions, I like to say. And it helps you, I like to say, work with your emotions rather than feeling like you're working against them.
What are the 4 skills that DBT offers that really can help HSPs?
Yeah, so DBT is broken up into 4 modules, generally speaking. So, broadly, the 4 categories are mindfulness, emotion regulation skills, distress tolerance skills, and what they call interpersonal effectiveness skills, which has to do with relationships.
Do you find that HSPs come to you very self-aware that they feel things deeper than other people? Or is that something that they're just unsure of? Like they just know something is different?
Yeah. I would say for the most part, people come to me with a lot of awareness around being sensitive. Every once in a while, I pick up on it based on how people are describing something to me, and I'll say, I'm wondering, would you consider yourself someone who's maybe very sensitive generally? And that could be helpful because it brings some awareness, and then they're really validated of like, oh, it makes sense maybe why I reacted this way or why I feel this way about it. But for the most part, people, I think, have a lot of awareness around being sensitive.
Just historically, I think sensitive can be kind of a loaded word. Like it can come with a lot of negative connotation. Can you talk about what are some of the messages that sensitive people might have internalized about their sensitivity?
Yeah. Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about this. So, I think that it's different for boys and girls. I think that's an important thing to talk about, and we can kind of like put a pin in that. But generally speaking, internalized is bad or a negative thing. And I think it's often because adults or caretakers, people in the environment, teachers, coaches, whoever, struggle with knowing how to help both themselves and other people regulate their emotions.
Hmm.
So then when the sensitivity comes up, it brings up this uncomfortable feeling of like, ooh, I don't know how to help you with this. Like you need to just manage that and deal with it and make it go away because this is outside my wheelhouse. It makes me uncomfortable. I think that's often what comes up for people.
Hmm.
And I understand too, like if you're a parent to a really highly sensitive kid, it can just really be a struggle. I definitely get that.
It seems like in that case too, like a lot of messages are internalized very young because your parent might not know how to, work with that emotional sensitivity.
I would say so, yeah. Yeah.
This is maybe a tangent. Do you watch Love is Blind?
Okay, so I haven't finished I haven't finished the most recent season, but so I'm not caught up, but I have seen quite a bit of it. Me and my husband and my sister-in-law watch it together. It's like our fun thing that we do.
Yeah, I was just going to ask about Chelsea because I feel like she got a lot of hate for expressing a lot of her insecurities, but her emotions this season. So I was just curious about her from your perspective because I think like this kind of goes along with the society's view of the highly sensitive person and how it's too much or like over emotional, but like she sounds exactly what you're describing. So I was just curious because I literally just watched the finale last night.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to. Okay, so I was all caught up so I could comment on this specifically, but I will say that this kind of ties in with DBT because DBT is all about trying to be effective, right?
Hmm.
So with this person in particular, maybe it wasn't so much the sensitivity as much as like, are you being effective in communicating your emotions, processing your emotions? That is sometimes what people have a problem with, so to speak, but I don't know. In this particular instance, I'm not really sure since I'm not all caught up.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, we'll have to talk later offline about that when you catch up. So earlier you mentioned that window of tolerance. Can you talk about what that is and how someone can begin to understand what theirs might look like?
Yeah, for sure. So, window of tolerance. This is a phrase that was coined in the context of trauma therapy. So we teach this to people who are starting to do trauma work, processing their past traumas, to help them understand why they maybe go into either a state of what we call hyperarousal or hypoarousal. And I can explain what all that means. So basically, your window of tolerance is, and it changes day to day, right? You might wake up one day and it's smaller that day, and the next day it's wider for a variety of factors, which we'll also get into. But basically, this is your window of what you can tolerate that day, right? Like I will feel emotions and stuff will happen, but I'm in my window, which means that I'm grounded, I'm present, I'm relative. Like I'll feel stuff. I'll be feeling emotions, but I'm relatively calm, grounded. Like I'm present. I can handle stuff. So what we say is if you go up out of your window, you're in a state of what we call hyperarousal. Down out of your window is a state of hypoarousal. Hyperarousal, the example I use is like a panic attack is a state of hyperarousal. Hypoarousal is dissociated, right? You're like mentally checked out, like your body's physically present in the room, but mentally you're like elsewhere. So the idea is, something is more than what your nervous system can tolerate in that moment. That's hyperarousal, and hypoarousal is your brain and body's natural way of trying to take care of you, right? It's like too much, so we're going to dip out.
Just to relate this personally a little bit, like I was reading your book to prep for this interview and that really stuck with me. Just like I just went through a cancer situation and what I realized in it is people talk about a lot about that numbness, which I think is very similar to dissociation. Like you're kind of just like going through the motions. And what I hadn't expected through this was that kind of dissociation until like I finished my active treatment. And then there was like this window of time where it was like okay, the treatment is done and now we're just waiting to see if it worked. And there's like this month where you just don't know, are you cancer free? Like, do I have to do more of this? And what I wasn't expecting was kind of this like huge outpouring of emotion that I felt like in that window of time of the unknowing, where like I was finally processing like what had actually happened. And I would literally like you're saying, that hyper arousal, I was like crying every day and I like literally couldn't stop it. And it didn't feel logical. Like I would just sit there and just start crying. And so like that was like a really interesting experience of going from one to completely the other without understanding why, or like without any notice. Like I was like, okay, I'm just getting through it. And now I'm just like emotionally wrecked.
Yeah, yeah. That totally makes sense to me. I absolutely believe that because I mean, chemotherapy, like, what a significant trauma to go through, and that does such a number on your body physically and emotionally and mentally. Thinking about like, am I gonna survive this, and the stress of having to deal with like, yeah, that does such a number on you that it makes sense to me completely that your body and mind are just like, we just have to like, the window is this big. We literally just have to survive. I can absolutely understand that.
Yeah, it's like almost coming out of the like survival mode. I think like the numbness was just like, okay, like got to get through this. And then it was just like, whoa, okay. There's all the emotions that I was not expressing the last few months, you know?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And my understanding is you've got some good news recently, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm cancer free, and my type of cancer, it was a tumor that was crushing my airway. So like I literally couldn't even speak at the time before we knew what it was, and thankfully, it responded really well to chemo. It was Hodgkin's lymphoma, and unfortunately, I was on a feeding tube for 4 months. So now I'm back to eating, which has been just like great. And I'm like, okay, like now I'm settling on the other side of it. But along with that window of tolerance, if someone's looking to expand theirs, because maybe some people's might feel smaller, what are some ways that people can begin to expand that window of tolerance?
Yeah, yeah. So I think it makes sense to start paying attention to whether you often find yourself in that sort of agitated hypo or hyper arousal state versus noticing that you're checked out, your mind is often elsewhere, or feel it. A lot of times with dissociation, people describe it as sort of like an out of body experience, or like I don't feel connected to my environment. Things around me like don't feel real. With hyperarousal, it might be learning breathing exercises to help. Like 5, 6, 7 is a popular one that I teach people because there's some science behind this. If the out breath is longer than the in breath, it automatically kicks into gear your parasympathetic nervous system, which means your heart rate's going to slow down. It lowers your blood pressure. So something like that. If you find that you're often in a state of hyperarousal, as we call it, or on the flip side, hypoarousal, it might be grounding skills, doing things to sort of activate your senses and bring you back into the present moment.
Are there good methods for kind of like looking inward in those moments? Because I have to imagine that like maybe that self awareness is a little less when you're in those either hyper or hypo states. Like you're kind of just there, or you're really in the emotions. How can you like recognize when you're in one of those and take the step back to do those skills to begin expanding?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's definitely easier said than done. And I think that it's important to give yourself a lot of grace too, because I think that if there's always a reason why your brain and body are doing what they're doing, right? And so if you are really in that state of hypoarousal and you're checked out, going straight to like if you notice it and then going straight to trying to ground, I think you could be doing yourself a disservice and like maybe even make it worse, right? Before going back and first thinking about like, wow, I am really needing this for so like this is serving a purpose for me right now, like this is what my body needs right now. And that's not to say that it might not be beneficial to do some of those grounding skills or whatever. But I think being gentle with yourself it makes it easier to bring awareness.
Yeah, definitely. So in your book, you write that prevention is the best medicine. Can you talk about what that means?
I think that it's a lot easier to practice the emotion regulation skills, for example, over a period of time. And then maybe you get to a hard spot, something happens, you're struggling for, whatever number of reasons. Then you've got the foundation built up, and it's going to be easier to ride the waves versus you're not practicing the skills, you haven't thought about these things already, and then you get to a hard spot and it's like, now I'm in a hole and I feel overwhelmed and I don't know how to ride the waves, so to speak.
Yeah, so like prepping for the storms.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying earlier, that emotion regulation is one of the four main categories of skills in DBT, and that's really what emotion regulation is all about. It's sort of the opposite of distress tolerance, or distress tolerance is like the crisis has already happened and you need something to help you survive like in that moment, where emotion regulation is like, let's see if we can prep ahead of time.
We'll be right back after this short break.
I'm Dr. Lindsay Gibson. Growing up with emotionally immature parents can affect their adult children in several ways. Most of all, it affects the child's ability to trust themselves as adults and to see themselves as people of value who have healthy entitlements to respect and their own individuality. So join me on this adventure of self-discovery. For more details, go to adultchildrencourse.com.
I want to go back a little bit, something you mentioned earlier in the conversation about how this, highly sensitive portion affects men and women differently. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I'm trying to be a little more brave about speaking about this, because I think there was a different interview I did and I sort of chickened out and I didn't like fully say what it was that I wanted to say, which is basically that, like, we live in this patriarchal society, and so things that are assigned as feminine are automatically assigned bad, is basically the straightforward
Mm-hmm.
explanation. And so we associate emotions with femininity. So then when someone's emotional, they're hysterical, and it's a negative thing inherently, is how I view it in a lot of ways.
After all this, I've been reading just a lot of just medical books because I've been interested in like the body after all of my medical stuff. I saw this joke and it was like, yeah, by this point in my illness, like I would have been sent off to like wait out my hysteria by the sea.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, I see the memes on Instagram about like, oh, I'm waiting for my prescription to go live in like an English seaside town. I'm like, that. I mean, it doesn't sound bad.
It doesn't sound bad, no.
That sounds great, actually.
One of the parts of your book that stood out to me was the concept of opposite action. Can you talk about that and give us an example of that?
Yeah. So in DBT, we say that opposite action is the skill to use when the feelings don't fit the facts. So basically, what that means is, like one of my go-to examples is, let's say you are really hardcore avoiding a bunch of work that you're behind on. There's like some really strong avoidance going on, and there's a ton of fear. The avoidance is the behavior that's occurring because of the fear emotion, right? But then in this case, the emotion doesn't fit the facts, right? There's nothing, there might be some fear around like, what if I fail the assignment? What if my teacher doesn't feel like it's smart enough? But there isn't an actual threat, right? The fear does not fit the facts. And so opposite action says do the opposite of whatever the urge is in order to break the cycle. So instead of avoid, you approach, which will change your emotion, change the behavior, and get you out of the cycle. The opposite of approach is avoid, or the opposite of avoid is approach, so that's opposite action.
I love that. And you know what? I did that this morning without even knowing what it was. Like I've struggled a lot with like my self-image because it's changed a lot. And my urge is to wear a wig to feel like more socially accepted because I'm not fully comfortable with not having my hair. But I was like, you know what? I am not going to wear a wig for this conversation. I'm just gonna like rock the buzz cut that I have. And I've tried doing that, like just going to the store. I'm like, okay, like I'm not going to wear a head covering because I was like avoiding looking sick, quote unquote. But I've been trying to actively just like avoid that feeling.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. I love that. That's amazing. Yeah. And do you notice a difference in how you feel as a result?
Yeah. It's just not like nobody pays that much attention to you. Especially when I was in like the heat of chemo, when I literally had no hair on my head and I had like a feeding tube attached and a backpack. Like I felt like I looked visibly sick and I just thought everybody would just see it. Maybe some people like look over, but it's true that nobody really cares about who's walking next to them at Target or whatever, right? Like, so it helps me to be like, they're not looking at you like that. Like, just exist in, whatever fashion you are now. Like, just existing is okay. And so I finally like feel like I've gotten to that point. It helps that I have a little hair growing back, but like I've actively had to be like, it doesn't matter. Like, really.
Yeah, that's very wise. Yeah, I've talked a lot about this a lot with my clients, how everyone's so wrapped up in themselves. People are noticing us so much less than we think they are sometimes, for sure.
Totally. Like, we're all just like, everyone can see this about me. And it's like, no, nobody really cares. Like, it's you're the one that cares, right? And if you can get rid of that, then I think you're going to be a lot happier.
Yeah, I think that's true for sure.
How does tuning into your body help to regulate those emotions?
Yeah. So our emotions are a physical experience, right? That is the emotion, that like knot you get in your stomach, or the sick feeling, or the tightness in your chest, or a lump in your throat. There's a physical experience that goes with all of our emotions. And so if we are tuned into what we're experiencing, we are fully aware, which means that we can fully address it. If we're not tuned in to the full experience and we're sort of like half addressing it, is basically how I view it. So, for example, like the body cue, having the tightness in your chest or lump in your throat or whatever, if you're tuned into that, it can prompt you to maybe like take a deep breath, which then helps you regulate your emotions, because then your body can intuit what you're needing in that moment.
It also seems like that would you kind of said it, but it like makes you pause and take a step back and like come a little bit out of that emotion so that you can, address it.
Yeah, for sure.
And you mentioned this a little earlier. You were talking about, a lot of this work requires being really kind to yourself and giving yourself kind of that break. I think validation goes along with that. Can you talk about the role that validation plays in sort of emotion regulation and, tuning into those feelings and working through them?
Yeah, for sure. DBT is really big on validation. They have, in one of the lessons for the skills group, they have multiple worksheets on it. In my book, I wrote a whole chapter on validation, which I was really excited about because, yeah, it's definitely really important, not just for your relationships with other people, which is what a lot of what DBT focuses on, but my chapter was all about self-validation, because it's definitely a huge part in being able to regulate your emotions. If you I think that a lot of people who struggle with making friends with their emotions, as I say, I think it's oftentimes they have a part of them. It's sort of like this voice in their head that's constantly like, you're too sensitive, you shouldn't be feeling this way, that feeling is like way outsized, like, all this negative talk and a lot of should haves. And this is sort of another conversation, something for people to explore in individual therapy. But that's a whole path you can go down of like, where does that voice come from? Whose voice is that? Like,
Mhm.
that's sort of another topic. But basically, self validation is being able to change that language a little bit and reminding yourself that your emotions are always inherently valid, because whatever pops up, that's just what pops up, right? There's no right or wrong here. Whatever you feel is just whatever you feel, right? And then you can, how you respond in turn is a different story, right? Like there's unhelpful versus helpful things that you can do in response, but how you feel is just always how you feel. So if you can learn to change the narrative to like, okay, more accepting, like this is just what I feel in this moment, that's going to help you not fight against it so much. And the less you're fighting against it, the easier it's going to be to work with it.
Do you find that a lot of HSPs seek external validation from other people?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think that that is definitely a very common thing. Earlier we were talking about how there's a strong genetic component and how also trauma can contribute. And I think that for people who are very sensitive, especially if they didn't grow up in a validating environment, there's this part of them, because validation is very natural, right? All of us seek validation. And for some of us, we receive it and find it a lot more easily if we're used to it. But if we're not used to it and we didn't get it growing up, for example, especially from the people where it was like really, really important that we got it, like it was their
Hmm.
job to give it and they didn't, we're way more sensitive to trying to get it where we can take it because it's a natural need.
And this is funny because I wonder if this is a common problem with like older daughters. Like I've heard of the older daughter syndrome.
It's a real
And
thing.
as an older daughter myself, not that I wasn't validated, but I was harder on myself than my parents ever were on me. So like I find this concept of self-validation interesting because I feel like that would have been a great skill to have because I was so hard on myself.
Yeah, I relate to that so much. I'm also an oldest daughter, and I think that sometimes, and then like this has been true as a therapist too, and now I'm a mom too, and so it's like you're busy momming everyone else in a sense. It's like you need your own little
Hmm.
internal mom to mom you sometimes, you know. And my mom also mommed me plenty growing up,
Yeah.
you know? But I totally relate to like being really hard on yourself and like perfectionist stuff, and
Hmm.
yeah, I get that.
Yeah, and with that, like, mindset, my diagnosis was really hard for me because I still wanted to take care of everybody. I wanted to take care of my dad and my husband and my sister and, like, shield them from it when I was the one going through it, just because that was, like, my MO. So I think that's just such an interesting, phenomenon that's totally, totally true.
Yeah, for sure, no doubt about it, for sure.
So what is the difference between self-validation and self-compassion?
I think of compassion as being more the kindness and the emotional experience. Obviously, with validation, there's an emotional experience that goes with it, but with validation, I think it more of like the words that you tell yourself and reframing the thoughts and the language. So I think, yeah, validation is maybe more focused on the language and how you experience that, versus compassion is more the experience of like the warm, fuzzy feeling that I get because of the validation, maybe.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, one thing we've talked a lot about in this conversation is the importance of interpersonal relationships. Can you talk about the three core skills for those?
Yeah, so generally speaking, DBT breaks things down into three categories. So the first main skill is being effective in getting what you want and what you need. So DBT has skills specifically for that. They also have skills for focusing on maintaining relationships and self respect. Obviously, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but generally speaking, people tend to kind of fall, their default is to fall into one side of the spectrum or other, where it's like maybe you're over apologizing, you don't stand up for your values. And so
Hmm.
there's an issue of needing to work on maintaining your self respect, basically. And then the other side of the spectrum is needing to focus on maintaining relationships because maybe you need to be more, as DBT describes it, gentle, validating,
Hmm.
the rest. And then DBT also teaches skills around changing your thoughts to change how you feel about someone. So, for example, if you notice that in social situations or in interpersonal interactions, you tend to make a lot of assumptions or there's a lot of mind reading, DBT can help you reframe a lot of that to be more effective in those interactions, helping you reframe assumptions, check assumptions, also helping, like, reminding you to give as much as you get and be interested in what the other person is saying, which I know it's, sometimes it comes across as like, do I really need to be taught that? But I think that it's really, really easy sometimes to forget.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if it's highly emotional situation.
For sure, for sure.
One thing too I want to ask, and we briefly talked about avoidance when we were talking about the opposite action, but why is avoidance such a unique challenge for HSPs?
I think it has something to do with how intense the emotions can feel if you are approaching rather than avoiding. So, like going back to my earlier example about avoiding your schoolwork or whatever, if you believe, if you have this automatic thought that the teacher is going to think it's dumb or whatever, and the emotion that accompanies that, if as an HSP, you're going to, you feel things more intensely, acutely, if that emotion is big, so it's going to feel easier to just avoid it rather than to approach something that does feel so big and overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. Another point that you make in your book is the importance of physical health to your emotion regulation. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, DBT is structured in a way that they have a whole section dedicated to this because there is a really strong correlation there, you know, like if you, like, everyone's had the experience of being hangry, right? People joke about
So
that.
real.
Yeah, that's a real thing for sure. And that's just part of being human. Like if you have a human body, this is part of the deal, is that you need to be cognizant of these things because if you're tired, if you're hungry, if you're under the influence of something, all of this stuff completely changes how you regulate your emotions. So being cognizant of those things is important if that's something you're working on.
One thing I love in your book, too, as we start to wrap up, is you refer to sensitivity as being a superpower or a gift. And in this conversation, you've talked about making friends with your sensitivity. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I really want people to feel that their sensitivity absolutely can be a strength. There's nothing inherently bad or wrong about it at all. And actually, the opposite is true. And I go over all this stuff in the first few chapters of my book because there's so much to say about this. I think that people who are highly sensitive make great leaders. DBT talks about this too. They make great leaders. They're passionate, fun to be around because the passion can be contagious. These people often really care about their relationships. The caring is also something that they feel intensely. So they are wonderful people to have relationships with. Being in tune and really acutely aware of your environment means that you pick up on stuff that other people don't pick up on, which is absolutely a superpower. Again, so long as you know to like check assumptions and yada, 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 right?
Mm-hmm.
But absolutely, it can be a huge, huge strength if you learn how to work with it, for sure.
Yeah, I love that. I think, there's a great deal more empathy with somebody who feels things deeply. And I think that is absolutely a skill that a lot of people are lacking.
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
Well, Emma, do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
I guess the only thing that's really coming to mind right now is just that, again, kind of more of what we were just talking about. I just really want people to feel empowered and feel good about being sensitive and about feeling like they can make friends with their emotions rather than feeling like it's something to fight against or work against. I just really I've seen people make incredible progress in this area with DBT skills and, trauma therapy, all the rest. And so, yeah, I want people to feel empowered and confident and well cared for.
Yeah, and I think your work and your book go a long way in helping people with that. So thank you so much for your time and for your work and uplifting people who feel things intensely and making them see the value and the gift in that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Have you ever been told that you're too sensitive? Do your emotions often feel intense or overwhelming? If so, you may be a highly sensitive person, or HSP. HSPs are often empathic, intuitive, and passionate, but they also can struggle with strong emotions. DBT Skills for highly sensitive people will help you understand and balance your emotions and reframe your emotional sensitivity as a strength, not a weakness. Using skills from dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, this evidence-based guide will show you how to increase emotional resilience and learn to appreciate your sensitivity for the superpower it is. With this book, you'll learn to understand and regulate your emotions, read your body's physical responses to difficult emotions, and discover effective ways to self-soothe when the outside world feels overwhelming. You'll also find strategies to help you deal with difficult or challenging interactions with others. Emotional sensitivity is a gift, but it's important to learn how to manage your emotions so they don't get in the way of relationships and reaching your goals. With this book as your guide, you'll find the balance you need to be your very best. Visit our website at www.newharbinger.com and use coupon code PODCAST25 to receive 25% off your entire order. New Harbinger Publications is an independent, employee-owned publisher of books on psychology, health, spirituality, and personal growth. For over 50 years, our evidence-based self-help books and pioneering workbooks have helped readers make positive changes to improve mental health and well-being. Founded by psychologists Matthew McKay and Patrick Fanning, New Harbinger is proud to be an employee-owned company. Our books reflect our core values of integrity, sustainability, compassion, and trust. Written by leaders in the field and recommended by therapists worldwide, New Harbinger books are practical, accessible, and provide real tools for real change. Join the New Harbinger Clinicians Club, a free membership club exclusively for mental health professionals. Sign up today and you'll receive a special welcome gift, 35% off all professional books, free client resources, free ebooks throughout the year, access to private sales, a subscription to our Quick Tips for Therapists email program, and more. Visit newharbinger.com/clinicians-club for more information. Do you have an idea for another episode? Do you want to send us a message? Our email address is podcast@newharbinger.com. We'd love to hear from you. This podcast was edited by Jesse Fancushion. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love if you rated, reviewed, and subscribed to the show, and we hope that you might share it with anyone who could benefit from the content. This podcast is not a substitute for counseling with a licensed provider.